I'm looking at this submittal by Mr. Freilich. It says O'Donnell's opinions for Schabusiness trial. And it looks like he asserts that he'd like Dr. O'Donnell to address the court on 4 issues. And I want you to, other than the fact that the submittals were way beyond the deadline that I gave, other than that fact, I want to address these topics with you. So there are 4 opinions. 2 of them are kind of compound opinions because they're 2 parts. But I want to go over them with you. So first of all, opinion number 1, Taylor Schabusiness was acutely intoxicated and impaired by acute methamphetamine use at the time of the alleged asphyxiation. I don't want to spend a great deal of time on that one because I'm a little concerned that that's not even relevant to anything that the jury has to address because it goes to the voluntary intoxication issue. I want to focus on the second piece, Mr. Lizzie. The long-term and excessive use of methamphetamine has chronic brain damage consequences. So Dr. O'Donnell's a pharmacologist. He wants to give that opinion. Frankly, the opinion almost seems common sense, although, granted, I think some of us think that would occur if you long-term use of controlled substances, but he's an expert on this topic. What's the state of objection if he gives that opinion?
I think the concern that the state has on that is largely that he's not in a position to tell us whether that actually happened to this particular individual in this circumstance. And I think the suggestion here is that it's prejudicial to the state's case for him to suggest that when he's not, I think, qualified to discuss the fact that she has any of those issues. I don't know that those tests were done. I don't know that any of the mental health professionals who've met with her have opined that. So to me, absent that, I don't think he's qualified to make that assessment. He's merely talking about the fact that that is a possibility, that it could affect brain development. And I haven't heard anyone tie that to this case and to this defendant.
Right. So I get what you're saying. But then all you and I can do is look at what the document says. And so far, this document says he's not going to tie any of these to this case. So I want to go through each one of them with you, because there's something that's not in this document, and I don't know if it's ever going to show up in this document. And then we're down to just a relevance issue.
Right.
So, I guess my perspective is that if a pharmacologist wants to opine that methamphetamine use long-term could cause brain damage, I'm not sure that he's so totally incompetent to say those kinds of things. Whether he can connect it with this case is another issue, but that's not in this document, so I'm going to move along. Point number 2, probably your answer is going to be very similar, and that is long-term adolescent use of marijuana arrests brain development. I guess my own conventional wisdom is that the jury is still out on the effects of long-term marijuana use on individuals, that there's a debate about that. On the other hand, this is long-term adolescent use of marijuana, and I guess my thought is, again, he's a pharmacologist, and he wants to say, look, marijuana is a drug, and if you use it long term, it's my professional opinion to a reasonable degree of certainty that might cause someone brain damage. Again, is your concern more that whether he's going to be able to connect it with this case or that he can give that opinion?
Correct. I think it's really more that he can't connect it specifically to this case. I think potentially he could give that opinion. I also think that's a very vague suggestion. So what does that mean in terms of the brain development? Does it affect it in a way that would essentially demonstrate the same types of symptoms that you might see from mental health? Does it affect the brain in a way that would render someone NGI? That I don't know. I mean, there's no real discussion in here. There's no meat to many of these points. And again, this is where the timeliness is an issue, because these are things that we would have liked to explore with him if we knew that those were his opinions. So that's really kind of undeveloped, and I don't know that he could render an opinion that would suggest it affects brain development to the extent that it would render someone NGI. Not just that, yes, it hinders brain development. Does it actually render someone unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct or unable to conform their conduct with the law, which is the standard?
Okay. The next point, it's in bullet point 3. Taylor Schabusiness was not treated with psychotropic drugs to control or mitigate her psychiatric illness. lot to unpack there, but your concern there?
Yeah, so my concern there is that I don't think anyone has a clear diagnosis about Taylor's conditions, and anyone really that can accurately set forth whether she has a condition that would require that. So while he could potentially testify about the impact of not taking medications, in the field of mental health, I mean, that's an ongoing process that a treatment provider is frequently adjusting medications based on conditions, based on manifested symptoms. The general conclusion that you could say someone who does suffer from a psychosis, who doesn't take their prescribed medications, is going to worsen, I think, again, that's something that is kind of obvious to anyone, that the jury might expect that someone who has an untreated psychosis is going to have an issue. I think the concern here is that we don't have a clear description of what her psychosis was or would have been. And in fact, I think probably the best indication of that is what Dr. Seipel talked about at the last hearing, which was she had been prescribed some drugs in the jail and she wasn't taking her drugs, and there isn't a noted difference in her behavior from the time frame when she stopped taking the drugs to the time frame before. So I don't know that he's in a position to know what exactly her diagnosis was and what drugs she should take. And I think what further exacerbates the state's concerns is that if you go down to all of the subsections in 3, and then everything else that's attached in terms of the articles that are relied upon, all of those things relate to schizophrenia. And frankly, there's only like one mention of schizophrenia in all of the medical records, and it's Dr. Lucetta opining that it's perhaps possible that she may have schizophrenia, and we might need some further analysis to determine that. The remainder of the people say bipolar. No one even says schizophrenia.
Sure. And to compound that, Mr. Lizay, in the transcript of Dr. O'Donnell, page 179, he even notes on line 14, did not see a formal diagnosis of schizophrenia. So I hear you. I take your point there, and I'm trying to move this along because the jury will be ready to go shortly, and I don't intend to make this decision right now. The point is to discuss what we need to do to move forward on this issue. The next bullet point, or the next piece of 3 was one of those compound points. Psychotropic drugs do have efficacy in a large percentage of patients who take them. Again, it kind of goes without saying, but if he's a pharmacologist who wants to opine about the use of drugs, depending on whether he can connect it with this case, which this letter doesn't seem to say, concerns with him making that opinion?
Not with his qualifications to make that opinion, just again, that I don't think we have a clear diagnosis. He's not in a position to diagnose.
Okay. Then moving on to the final point that is in this memorandum, that's point 4. Taylor Schabusiness' use of methamphetamine worsened her untreated psychiatric conditions. And you've kind of alluded to that regarding the discussion you made regarding the doctor's reference to psychiatric illness under page 4. Okay, so I get a sense of where the state is at. I'm going to turn to you, Mr. Freilich.
Judge, if I could be heard just on that final point again. So on that last point, I think the real concern there is, and this is echoed throughout, not just this opinion that he provided, but then also Attorney Freilich provided the email. I mean, the crux of Dr. O'Donnell's opinion, both at the motion hearing and now, is that acute use of methamphetamine, that is methamphetamine use on the night of the incident, was a driving factor in all of the things that we're seeing from Ms. Schabusiness. And he even indicates that in point 4. And that's simply not a valid argument for the jury to hear in this case, is that her acute toxicity for methamphetamine, her active present use, her voluntary ingestion of methamphetamine on the night of this instance, was the driving force. And if that's his opinion, and that's really echoed throughout all of these things that have been provided, that's not a relevant consideration for the jury and NGI, because we're talking about her voluntary current use of methamphetamine and how it exacerbates the whole thing. So I just think that is entirely present through his entire opinion, and that's one of the state's primary concerns.
Okay. So, Mr. Freilich, I'm going to turn to you, and I guess, some of the I read the material that you had and submitted. I read that email, and I guess some of my concerns you've now heard outlined with Mr. Lizay, and that is this document doesn't necessarily connect much of what he's indicating with Ms. Schabusiness. For example, point number 1, Taylor Schabusiness was acutely intoxicated and impaired by acute methamphetamine use at the time of the alleged asphyxiation. So there's obviously disputes about the level of intoxication that existed at the time of these events. And that dispute arose, I think, even in questioning him before when he was here, because he said, yep, I got the information that the parties, Ms. Schabusiness and the decedent shot up trazodone, but that's not true, because we didn't find any in the blood of the victim, and so that has to be false. So there's a dispute really about the nature of the intoxication at the time, but I also have concerns about its relevance. But the next bullet point under 1 is the long-term and excessive use of methamphetamine has chronic brain damage consequences. And I guess the question I have is he going to suggest that Ms. Schabusiness has brain damage? Because I guess I'm concerned about whether he can testify to that fact, because he's a pharmacologist. And I'm perfectly willing to say, in the context of a Dauber hearing, that he has expertise in pharmacology, and I don't need to hear from him again to make that finding, because he testified in front of me before. So, Mr. Freilich, that's my concern.
I understand that, Your Honor. I know that Dr. O'Donnell did meet with my client and got a lot of her history, her drug use history, when he met with her previously. In my opinion, I know that Dr. O'Donnell is a board-certified pharmacologist. He's testified in many trials in Illinois. I believe that he would have the knowledge to indicate that if you use methamphetamine long-term, it could cause chronic brain damage consequences. So, I mean, I think it is relevant to the issues as it relates to NGI, but what we have here is a person who has, I would submit, mental health issues that have gone untreated with medication, and then when you apply a layer of drug use on top of that, it could create a psychosis, a mental disease or defect. Additionally, I submitted to the court the records from Bellin Health, from Nicolay Psychiatric Center, the order for civil commitment, and the order for psychotropic medications, and jail records. And I believe Dr. O'Donnell reviewed most of those, but that also, I think, is the link or the connection here to show that my client does have a mental health history. So I think with some sort of a limited purpose, I would ask that Dr. O'Donnell be allowed to testify as to some of these things that he opines about in the report that he provided.
Well, you've gone way beyond my first question. I think you were kind of talking about point 4, Taylor Schabusiness' use of methamphetamine worsened her untreated psychiatric conditions. I was at point 1. The long-term and excessive use of methamphetamine has chronic brain damage consequences. So I want to. You've indicated if he shows up here and testifies, Judge, if you let him testify, he's got 4 opinions. It's right here. Those 4 opinions among them are: number 1, she was acutely intoxicated and impaired by acute methamphetamine use at the time of the alleged asphyxiation. I'm not sure that that's relevant, but we're going to move on to the second piece, which is the long-term and excessive use of methamphetamine has chronic brain damage consequences. And my question is, if I let him launch that out to the jury, is that just a statement that, look, just for anybody, that might be the case? I don't know whether it's true for Ms. Schabusiness or not, but it might be, but it might not be. And the jury is simply left to speculate because we threw something at them, and now they can try to figure out whether that has any relevance for this case. Because the end of that sentence being, there's chronic brain damage consequences, and I haven't heard anybody opine that Ms. Schabusiness has chronic brain damage. And so I don't know how he's going to be able to come in and say, I've reviewed the records. She has chronic brain damage. I'm a pharmacologist. She takes a lot of drugs. Based upon the brain damage that I'm seeing from the reports, because I don't do brain damage, but based upon the reports I see, it was caused by these drugs. I'm I'm not seeing the connection.
Well, I mean, we saw the pictures. I mean, in the basement at 829 Stony Brook Lane, there was a meth pipe, there was methamphetamine, as testified by Detective Scanlon. The history that my client provided, I think Dr. O'Donnell could opine that if you use methamphetamine long-term, it may cause chronic brain damage. He's not a doctor. He's not going to be able to say whether Ms. Schabusiness has brain damage, but he can provide that information, and the jury can decide whatever it feels is appropriate. That's within their purview. That's their prerogative to take that information and then make
So
a determination.
and I don't mean to interrupt you, but
Sure.
obviously we're running low on time.
Okay.
You're not going to ask him, well, Dr. O'Donnell, do you believe that excessive use of methamphetamine has caused chronic brain damage in Taylor Schabusiness? You're not going to ask him that question.
No, I would ask, could it or may it cause that kind of damage?
Point number 2, long-term adolescent use of marijuana arrests brain development. Mr. Lizet expressed concern about a number of frankly, the modifiers that are in there. I'm not sure what long-term adolescent use, actually there's a typo in that sentence. I didn't notice it till right now, but I'm assuming it's long-term adolescent use. He's going to try to define what that means, because I'm not sure how he's going to discern, what a long-term use is. Somebody could use it for a week and he might say, that's pretty long. Somebody could use it for 10 years and conceivably someone could say, well, that's not really long depending on how old they are. And then the arresting of brain development, I guess, and I'm kind of compounding the question for you, but again, I'm not seeing that there's any testimony that there has been brain development.
Your Honor, when my client met with Dr. O'Donnell, I believe that she reported that she was a daily user of marijuana, and so if he would be allowed to come in and testify that it could cause some issues with brain development, that's where I would go with that.
And again, it sounds like what you're saying is, his testimony is, here's what she reported to me. If that's true, she might have brain development, but she might not.
Right. Yes.
The third point is Taylor Schabusiness was not treated with psychotropic drugs to control or mitigate her psychiatric illnesses. And I had some concerns there because, we had a number of evaluations that were conducted in this case, and I'm not clear that anybody has a good understanding of whether or not she even has a psychiatric illness. I will tell you, I'm aware of the fact that there was that one diagnosis for bipolar outlined, I think, at Nicolay, and then that was disputed, and frankly, that was even disputed by a defense. I think Dr. Lucetta disputed that. I read over her report last evening in preparation for this conversation we're having right now. That defense expert, Dr. Lucetta, wasn't sure, and there was concern about whether or not that diagnosis was accurate in light of the fact that the drug use that occurred at the time that she came in to get the diagnosis. And so one of my concerns is that if there's testimony that she wasn't treated with drugs to mitigate a psychiatric illness, here are the psychiatric illnesses that she should have been treated with. One of the problems I'm having now is the state should have the opportunity to, for example, call in Dr. Lucetta, who did a defense evaluation, to say, I don't know that I can support Dr. O'Donnell's conclusion that she has a psychiatric illness. There's a dispute about that. And so I guess I'm wondering, what can you tell me about that? And I will note, too, that as part of that bullet point, Dr. O'Donnell goes on to a conversation about schizophrenia. And as you know from what I read to Mr. Lizet, Dr. O'Donnell testified that he didn't even find a diagnosis of schizophrenia in all the records.
Your Honor, I know that my review of the Bellin records, the Nicolay records, the jail records, and other documents that I obtained on behalf of Ms. Schabusiness, it indicated that she frequently did not want to take the medications, that she refused the medications. And when you don't take your medications and you have a psychiatric illness or a mental health problem, your condition could be exacerbated. It could get worse over time. And so I think that it would be relevant for Dr. O'Donnell to talk about that. He's got information directly from my client and from the other records, and then he could provide some information about that.
Sure, and so I guess I want to drill into this a little bit further, because I want to make sure I understand what you're asking of me. And again, I'm not going to make a decision right now. I'm already running 5 minutes late, which I don't like to do. But Dr. O'Donnell, it seems what you're telling me is Dr. O'Donnell would say something along these lines. If someone has a psychiatric illness and they don't take their medications, that could be bad. We don't know whether she has a psychiatric illness or not. But if she does, and if she doesn't take any meds for it, that could be a bad thing. That's pretty much where we're at.
Yes.
The statement, psychotropic drugs do have efficacy in a large percentage of patients who take them. I'm not going to quibble over that, because if he's going to be here to testify, I don't know that, frankly, having him give that opinion, I think, frankly, many people who take psychotropic drugs for things such as depression or other mental assertion from the Nicolay records that she had this diagnosis of bipolar, which again is disputed by even defense expert from a year ago. But is that what he's indicating? He wants to opine that if that I believe she has bipolar based upon that diagnosis, and if she'd have taken medications, she'd have been better?
I believe so, but if the court limits the line of questioning, I believe that, based on Dr. O'Donnell's history and knowledge, training, and experience, he could just generally testify that, if you use methamphetamine and you have some sort of a psychiatric condition, the drug use can, worsen your mental health condition.
Okay. It's starting to clear up, become clearer for me. Not exceedingly clear, but a little clear. And I'm going to afford the attorneys an opportunity to talk now that I've clarified things, because I've got some concerns, and they're along the lines of the state's concern about connecting things up. There are some opinions that are outlined in that document that I think this doctor could give, because he's a pharmacologist, and I'm satisfied based upon his experience that he could give those opinions. But the concern is how they tie into this case, because I'm sure he could give a lot of opinions about a lot of things, and he'd be qualified to give all of them, but they have nothing to do with this case. And that's my concern. So, and I'll render decisions on these issues, but I'm going to certainly afford the parties an opportunity to speak a little bit, find out whether there's any accommodation you can reach for limited use of Dr. O'Donnell. But if not, I'll render decisions on all of it, and I'll just indicate how it's going to happen.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else to bring up before we go back on the record with the jury? Mr. Saunders.
No, not from the state.
From the defense, Mr. Fraser.
There's an issue, but we'll bring it to your attention later on.
Well, I'd like to if you can bring it to my attention now so I can think about it, and then I can talk more intelligently.